Concrete marker stones. When Keeler did his restoration in this particular quadrant, he did it in 1939. It was the last bit of restoration he did, and he worked on the inner circle, which we're at the centre of now. And he was going to. It's known that there are buried stones all the way along the side there. They were found in the 1880s by Reverend A.C. Smith, who did probing into the ground with metal rods, and it's been confirmed by geophysics. Keeler intended to restore all that as he'd done with the other quadrants, but the war broke out and he had to stop everything, and by this point he'd pretty well burned his fortune anyway, and there wasn't a lot of money left. So Avebury's now reached this state and it's not going to change. It's a World Heritage Site and nothing's allowed to be changed now, so even though buried stones have been found, they have to be buried again, so everything has to stay the same as when it was declared a World Heritage Site. There's a good argument for not restoring it, in that often when things have been restored they've been done wrong and then they end up permanently mounted in concrete and they're going to stay that way forever. But as I'm sure you know, the smaller concrete markers are where Keeler dug down, removed all the topsoil down to the bare chalk, and there were sockets because the stones are fitted into sockets like teeth, and this was where the biggest stone in all of Avebury was, the big sort of phallic obelisk. When Stukely came in 1724, it had been toppled and was laid on the ground, so which is how he came up with the dimensions. But Terence Meaden did some work on it for a TV programme, and he built up loads of cardboard boxes up to the height that the obelisk would have been when it was in existence, and discovered that the shadow went all the way across there to what I call stone number 206, but Terry calls the vulva stone. And he saw it as a sort of sexual union of the shadow of this with the stones over there. But what I'd like to show you is how you can imagine that there are no cars, which is pretty difficult, but how reflective those stones are. So to get your bearings, we're in the centre of a circle which is about 100 metres in diameter. There are 5 stones surviving of it, that's the ones around there. And if I click these sticks together, you'll hear how the sound echoes off them. Can you hear that double? If I come past you actually, no, that's it, really clear. Yeah. Now imagine if there were stones all the way around us and there weren't any houses and the chapel wasn't there. You'd get an echo from one side to the other, and as well as that one repeat, you'd probably get 1 or 2 other repeats as well. I did a lot of work in going all the way around the circle, clicking these and making recordings and measuring the time back and everything, just to prove really how live the whole site is and how it must have been even liver thousands of years ago. And the only time I could get it traffic free was on New Year's Day. I came out in freezing fog, it was about 5 years ago. I got here for 8 o'clock and there wasn't a soul around. There was no bird song because I'd got up before the birds had, and a completely different perception of Avebury. A longer echo coming off those trees in the distance. There's too much ambient noise. I can hear the echo clearly off these ones, but sometimes you can get another echo that's even slower off the other ones. I can hear one behind me now. I think they must be coming off that wall behind you. Yeah, and realise just how the sound must have completely animated them. If this was seen as a place where the ancestors or some sort of spirits live, then echoes, if as I argue there was only sense and hearing wasn't recognised as a separate sense, then if you made a sound and the space responded, it would have been spirits or ancestors. These small stones, by the way, are called the Z-seeker, and they're completely buried until 1939. They were not even known to exist. They've got this red coating on them, which is called rock varnish, and it accumulates in splash zones of rivers. It's made of, it's a very thin coating of iron and manganese and clay. You see this sort of reddish brown coating, and you find it in America in desert regions where it's called desert varnish, and it takes tens of thousands of years to accumulate as a wind-blown deposit, but in splash zones of rivers it can accumulate in decades even. So all of these stones must once have been in quite a fast-flowing river for this rock varnish to have accumulated on them. I've no idea why this line of stones is here. People have suggested it's astronomical, but if it's astronomical, I would have thought it would have been in a straighter line. The stones are in definitely their original positions because all the sockets were found under the ground. So Keeler definitely erected them back in the right positions, but who knows what they're there for. I mean, that stone over there where you see that small stone sticking out of the ground, that's the ring stone. It was Stukely drew it as being about this high with a whole natural hole through it. You know, lots of the stones have natural root holes, and Stukely thought it was for where sacrificial victims were tied to the stone by the hole. Modern day pagans use it for hand fasting, and their idea is that people used to put their hands through it to do the hand fasting. But when Keeler dug down, that piece of stone was about 3 feet below the ground. It had been snapped off, and that was the only bit that survived. So he just raised it up so it could be seen where it had been originally. I always wondered whether the hole through it was used for like a star sighting or something. It would have been quite a nice way of doing it. Now let's have a look at stone 206 then. So as I was saying the other day, lots of the stones were destroyed in the early 1700s. It's a long and complicated story. The people who were mostly responsible for the stone breaking, what they were doing was toppling the stones into pits, putting loads of straw underneath them, lighting the straw and getting the stones really hot, and then pouring water on so that the stones cracked into lots of pieces. And this stone was one of the ones that was just broken into pieces. Keeler found all the pieces and then stuck it back together. So can you see there? It's like a seam. That's where they've put pieces of bronze rod in and chopped them into the stone to hold it together, and then filled in with cement. There's several on this side. If we look around the back, it's like a jigsaw. See, there's one. There's another. I think there's about 3 or 4 pieces to this stone.
Is it complete now?
Yeah, as far as I know it's complete now.
So they hadn't yet used them for building, obviously. Were they just trying to break them up?
It became like a belligerence to me. A lot of the people that were doing the breaking were non-conformists. We're now in the southwest quadrant, which was the second one that is the second quadrant that Keeler restored. And when Keeler got here in 1935, I think 36, there were only 2 stones standing. All the rest had been toppled in the medieval period and were buried beneath the ground. It was a complete surprise to everyone. The way the stones are numbered, you were all with Maria over the other side with those 2 huge stones. The one nearest to us of those 2 is stone number 1. The one next to it is numbered 98, and that was working on the idea that there must have been 98 stones in the outer circle. That's not known for certain, but the numbering system has survived. The road was moved this way. Originally it went through those 2 large stones. So from stone number 1, you can count all the way around. This is stone number 7. Let's continue around a bit. Now you notice that the stones are all arranged aligned to the curvature of the circle. So they're all got their flat side mounted on the radius of the circle, except a couple of stones here and there that are twisted. And this one, stone number 8, is twisted, as you can see, about 15 degrees out of line. This is one of the stones that never fell, and in fact all the stones that are skewed were never toppled, ever, in the original position. They've all been reset in concrete, Keeler had this idea that he was going to make sure none of them fell down again. So although this one was perfectly okay and had never been toppled, it's still got concrete around it. And let's go on to the next one. Oh yeah.
You might as well carry on talking.
All right. Yeah, I'll have to carry on for a bit. Someone else is showing you this next. I'll tell you about it from here. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. This next stone is number 9, which is known as the Barber Surgeon stone. And when it was buried under the ground, when Keeler excavated it, they found a skeleton beneath the stone, trapped underneath the stone. And the idea that came about that this guy had been he had medieval coins in his pocket as well, which was really convenient of him for dating. And he had a pair of scissors, which were very rare in the medieval times. So Keeler, whose family were quite ancient, he discovered that some of his relatives had been barber surgeons. So therefore this person with the scissors must have been a barber surgeon, and he cooked up a story that he'd been helping to topple the stones for sort of religious reasons, and the stone had landed on him and killed him and trapped him, and he'd had to be buried where he fell. There's no evidence for that at all, apart from a pair of scissors on him. And it's been pointed out since then that the church and the abbey were at loggerheads all the time, and if you weren't aligned to one or the other, then you had no right to be buried on consecrated ground. And it's quite likely that this guy had scissors in his pocket because he was a tailor, a bit more mundane really, and that he could have died naturally and just been buried under the stone since it was a convenient place. With no idea. The skeleton disappeared for a few decades because it was taken to
Would have been smashed if it had landed on him.
well, it was part of him was trapped underneath it, and it looked as if it had toppled and landed on him, but the skeleton disappeared because the place where it was stored in London got hit by a bomb during the war, and it was thought to have been totally destroyed. And then Mike Pitts, who's a local archaeologist, found it again. Oh look, there's the scissors. Good old Busty.
No, Maria.
Maria, thank you.
Don't get me into trouble.
There are the scissors and the coins that were found in his pocket. And all these remains are in the Keeler Museum now. But it does seem quite likely that the bloke may have died a less interesting death than having a giant stone land on him. Can I give you that back then? Well, this question of the twisted stones I find really interesting, because if you're going to go to all the trouble of digging sockets to perfectly fit the stones, and you've got people moving 30-ton lumps of sarsen stone around, you'd think if they were all supposed to be mounted in like a dotted line, like nearly all of them are, that they wouldn't be able to make a mistake. Isabel Smith, who used to be the curator of the museum here until the 70s, thought that as they were sliding the stone in, it twisted at the last minute. I think it's deliberate and that it's somehow aligned, possibly to something astronomical. But how do you tell? Is the alignment along the long axis of the stone, or is it a flat face pointing to something? I've spent ages pondering this one and got absolutely nowhere. One of the stones of the avenue is tilted by about the same amount, about 15 degrees, and the other side of the pub, the northwest quadrant, again just one of the stones is twisted by about 15 degrees.
Oh, in the same orientation?
Yeah.
Have you done any acoustic work between the two, or
No.
any dowsing between the two?
Well, no, the problem with doing the acoustic thing is there are so many buildings in between.
Do you think it's an indication of an entrance point into the circle?
I don't know.
Split the energy.
In
Maybe.
Side of it.
Yeah.
In dowsing terms, it's called an exit gate, because when you have a circle and you have an offset stone, you get them at all stone circles. They'll be off by a few degrees. And Tom Graves did an awful lot of work into it, where energy goes round and round the stone circle and then leaves at one of the exit gates. And if you stand at roll right in a particular place and you put your hands up like that, you don't even need dowsing rods. You feel the exit gate. A lot of work was done at that on the Dragon project in the 1970s by Paul Devereux and John Steele. So in terms of earth energy, yeah, they're what you guys have picked up on already. Yeah, exit gates.
But they've come from several different sources, because I started looking at them a couple of years ago through a magnifying glass, and some stones are pink, some are blue, there's a few orange ones, and they have different types of holes that all indicate that they've come from different natural sarsen drifts that are in the area. The whole thing in my book about this, I think that the largest stones, like including 98 and 1, the two entrance stones that you saw earlier, they're about 80 tons, squarish shape, and they're all pink, but most importantly they're all 1 metre thick. And when the sarsen stone formed, it was a layer of sand that absorbed dissolved silica, so silica that had been dissolved in water, and the sand soaked this in. Over a very long period of time it dried out, leaving the stones being incredibly hard, like as hard as granite. But no one had bothered looking at them through a lens before, which seems bizarre to me. I'm not even a geologist. But what started it was the two huge stones over that side of the cove. One of them's pink and one of them's blue, so they obviously came from different places. And so I've mapped out, you can get an idea by the grouping of the stones that they've been moved the least possible distance. For instance, I think these stones along here came from further down the avenue, since they've all got a particular type of hole in them, which makes them quite distinctive. We can have a look at number 9 now. This is the stone I was playing with the other day, so have a go at it. Sorry, what's that?
Where's that tune?
Yeah.
Just gonna have a quick word with this guy here.
So it was real.
Makes a tune. Yeah, it's good. Back in drum, isn't it? Yeah, it's great.
We're the musicians. It's great in time, please.
Not big enough hand.
I'm a drummer, I can't handle it.
It's like an early radiophonic workshop.
Yeah.
These holes are made by roots of trees. When this was a layer of sand, so at some point the sand was laid down by a sea or a lake, and it accumulated in a layer. While it was still soft and just sand, trees grew through it. I've identified one of the trees as the swamp cypress, which still grows in the Everglades in Florida. It's found in sort of marshy ground, and it's associated with the mangroves. And to stabilise it in sort of soggy mud, it puts out these things called cypress knees, which come out from the base of the tree horizontally. And I think that's what these holes here are made from. If you imagine this stone would have been laid on its back originally, when it was a layer of sand, you can imagine how those roots just went straight through it. Then at a later date the wood from the roots just rotted away. Then the stone was hardened with silica, and it's like a fossil really. Something that was soft is now permanent and completely hard. But this one seems to have deeper holes than most of them, and kind of cavities behind the holes. If we carry on along this row, you'll see how some of the stones, the root holes, actually go right through the stone.
You got 3 faces in this stone.
Really?
Yeah. If you stand back here,
Yeah.
a bit more. Look on the left side, human face.
Oh yeah.
And if you look to the top right, you've got a gorilla's face.
Yeah.
Eyelashes and all. Then if you go to the other end and look back at the stone, you'll see another face.
Right.
Okay? And we've noticed it, and it's looking at the midwinter sunset, midsummer sunrise. If you take a look back at it now, look.
Yeah.
On the right hand side, the
Oh,
nose,
yeah.
the eyes, the ears.
This is probably one of the least attractive stones in Avebury because it was broken into pieces by heat and water and reassembled. All the bits were in the foundations of a garage, which was somewhere over that way when Keeler got here. You can see how it's been broken up, and at some places there are iron chisels still from where they were trying to break up the stone, and they've got the chisel stuck. Where is it? Along here somewhere. Easiest to spot when it's not wet, I think. I thought it would have been the other way around. There's a piece of iron in here somewhere. Can't see it. There are 2 chisels actually in this stone.
Both this side.
Yeah, I thought there was.
There's one there.
It's stuck into one of the cracks. I can't see it.
Down here.
Maybe that. Yeah, I think that's it. Yeah,
it,
you're right. Yeah, there you are. That's a piece of an iron chisel where someone was trying to break up the stone and the chisel got trapped. If you go out onto the downs where the natural drifts of sarsen are, you can find quite a few where people have lost chisels. Sarsen stone's incredibly hard, and there are lots of local stories that people who are working the stone would hit it with a chisel and it just bounces back and poleaxes you. It might just be stories. But this other stone has got some other interesting things as well. As we'll see later, in the West Kennet Long Barrow, some of the stones were reused. They were originally used for polishing axes. So people would roughly nap an axe to shape and then rub it on this very, very hard abrasive sarsen stone and polish it so that it was mirror smooth. And on this stone there are several polishing areas which you can feel. If you feel this area here, that's where the axes were polished.
Wow, very smooth.
And that could have been decades or centuries of rubbing on there.
Oh.
There are clearer ones inside the West Kennet Long Barrow, but there are several on the stones. There's some in the next quadrant. And generally they're mounted in fairly conspicuously. Some of them are mounted around the back of the stone setting. So it's hard to tell really whether the polishing marks were sort of revered or whether they were just taken for granted. Certainly in the West Kennet Long Barrow they're mounted in a way that they seem to be showing off the polishing marks. And it could have been that they were used for centuries. Interesting that they could only be used for polishing when the stone was laid on its back, like in its natural state. Because you need to put water on to help with the polishing process, and also you want gravity to assist you. You wouldn't. It's hard enough to polish a piece of flint without doing it on a vertical surface. So this could have been done hundreds, thousands of years even before the stone was erected.